The line at the checkpoint had gone quiet. My brother stood there with his VIP badge raised like a trophy, grinning at me over his shoulder. "Go on, get behind me," he said loud enough for the people around us to hear. "Maybe they'll take pity on you." I didn't answer him. I just reached into my coat and held out a small card with a QR code on it, the one that had arrived in a secured email 3 weeks earlier, the one I hadn't told a single person about. The woman at the scanner looked at her screen and her posture changed instantly. "I'm Nicole Turner. I'm 38 years old and I've spent most of my adult life in uniform doing work I was never allowed to talk about at dinner tables. In my family, that silence was mistaken for having nothing to say. My brother Brandon is 2 years older than me and has never met a room he didn't want to own. He works in political consulting, the kind of job that comes with a rotating cast of important people to photograph himself next to. He has a talent for making other people's proximity to power look like his own achievement. Growing up, he was the one my parents pointed to when relatives asked how their children were doing. I was the other one, the quiet one, the one who joined the army instead of law school, who came home on leave and got asked how much soldiers actually make, who missed birthdays because I was somewhere I couldn't name, and who learned slowly and without much drama that some rooms don't need an audience to matter. I want to be clear that I never resented Brandon for being who he is. What I resented, if I'm honest with myself, was the ease with which everyone around him decided that his version of success was the only one worth noticing. Mine happened without cameras. His happened at dinner parties. Over the years, I stopped correcting people. I stopped explaining what I did. It was easier to let them believe whatever story made sense to them, and frankly, most of what I did required exactly that kind of silence anyway. It came to a head on a Sunday evening at my parents' house, the kind of dinner where the pot roast is the least important thing being served. Brandon arrived 20 minutes late, phone already out, scrolling to something he clearly wanted us to see. "You are not going to believe this," he said, sliding his phone across the table to our mother first, because presentation has always mattered more to him than substance. It was an invitation, an actual, embossed invitation to a ceremony at the White House, the kind with a name printed on heavy cardstock and a wax-adjacent seal that probably cost someone real money to produce. My mother made a sound I can only describe as reverent. My father asked who he knew to get something like that. Brandon shrugged in the specific way people shrug when they want you to ask more questions, and launched into an explanation involving a client, a fundraising committee, and a senator's chief of staff, whose name he dropped with the casualness of a man setting a table. I sat there with my fork in my hand and said nothing because there was nothing useful to say. This was Brandon's moment, and I had long since learned not to compete for space that wasn't mine to take. That should have been the end of it. But Brandon has never been able to leave well enough alone when he senses an opening, and he sensed one in my silence. He turned to me, still holding that half-smile he uses when he's about to say something under the guise of a joke. "You've probably never even walked through those gates, have you?" he said. It wasn't really a question. It was a small practiced cut delivered at a dinner table in front of people who loved us both and wouldn't call him on it. I smiled. Not because it didn't land, it did in the quiet way these things always land after 20 years of practice, but because I already knew something he didn't. 3 weeks earlier, sitting alone in my apartment with a laptop and a cup of coffee gone cold, I had opened a secured message from a Department of Defense address I didn't recognize at first. It requested my presence at a ceremony in Washington, D.C., under a designation I won't describe here except to say it wasn't the kind of invitation you get from knowing the right consultant. It was the kind you get from years of work most people will never hear about. Work that doesn't come with photographs, work that had apparently reached someone's desk in a way I hadn't anticipated. I read the message twice, closed the laptop, and didn't tell anyone. Not my mother, who would have wanted to call the whole family immediately. Not my father, who would have asked questions I wasn't cleared to answer. And certainly not Brandon, who would have found some way to make it about the fundraising committee he was so proud of. So when he asked me at that table whether I'd ever walked through those gates, I just smiled, picked my fork back up and said, "Not yet." He laughed, satisfied, and moved on to describing the seating arrangement he expected to have. My mother asked if he'd wear the navy suit. Nobody asked me anything else for the rest of the night, which was fine. I had learned a long time ago that the moments that matter most are rarely the loud ones. They're the quiet ones you carry until it's time to use them. I finished my dinner, helped clear the table, and drove home in silence, turning the invitation over in my mind. I didn't know yet exactly what I was walking into. I only knew it wasn't going to be what Brandon expected, and for the first time in a long time, that was enough. Brandon didn't waste a single day turning that invitation into a personal press tour. By Monday morning, he'd already called our aunt in Ohio, our cousin in Charlotte, and apparently 3 people from his college fraternity, all to share the same piece of cardstock like it was a diploma. He posted a photo of the invitation on social media, angled just right, so the embossed seal caught the light, captioned with something about "humbled to be recognized among the nation's leaders." I saw it during my lunch break and set my phone face down on the table. My mother called that evening practically breathless. "Did you see what your brother posted? 300 likes already." I told her that was wonderful. I meant it mostly. Brandon has always needed the world's approval the way other people need water, and there was no use begrudging him something that came so naturally to him. What I minded, if I'm being honest, was what came next. "You should come by this weekend," she said. "Help him get ready. You know how he gets before something like this." I did know. Brandon, before an important event, is a specific kind of chaos, equal parts excitement and controlled panic, and somehow it always fell to whoever was nearby to manage it. I agreed to come by Saturday, mostly because I wanted to see my mother, and partly because some old stubborn part of me still hadn't learned to say no. I regretted it within 20 minutes of walking through the door. Brandon had turned my parents' living room into a staging area. Garment bags draped over every chair, a checklist taped to the wall, his phone propped against a lamp playing motivational business content at a volume I could hear from the kitchen. He handed me his suit the moment I walked in, not a greeting, just an object placed into my hands. "Can you steam this? I don't trust the machine at my place." Then, without waiting for an answer, "And can you drive Saturday? I don't want to deal with parking near the hotel." I steamed the suit. I said I'd drive. This is, I think, the quiet arithmetic of families like mine. You keep doing the small, invisible things because somebody has to, and it's always easier to be the one who does them than to watch nobody do them at all. It was somewhere around the 3rd demand of the afternoon that Brandon looked me over, actually looked at me for maybe the first time that day. "Don't wear your uniform, by the way," he said, folding a tie into his suitcase without looking up. "This isn't a base parade. It's a real event." I felt that land somewhere quiet in my chest, the way certain comments do when they're said so casually that arguing with them would make you look like the unreasonable one. I didn't say anything. I folded another shirt. My mother came in from the kitchen carrying a tray of coffee, and I watched her set it down in front of Brandon first, the way she always has, some habit worn so deep into our family's floor that nobody notices the groove anymore. "Your brother has worked so hard for this," she said to me, like I needed reminding, like I hadn't spent the entire afternoon steaming his shirts. "You know how these connections open doors." I nodded and drank my coffee. It got worse before it got better. Later that evening, with a few of our relatives gathered for what had somehow become a pre-departure celebration, Brandon held court in the middle of the room, recounting his fundraising work with the kind of embellishment that grows a little each time a story gets told. Somebody, an uncle I only see twice a year, asked whether I was coming too. Brandon answered before I could. "Nicole's not on the list," he said, easy as anything, like he was reading off a weather report. "She might get lucky and catch a photo outside if the security lets people stand near the gate." A few relatives laughed. Not cruelly, exactly, more the reflexive kind of laughter people offer when someone confident says something with a smile on his face. My mother didn't correct him. She just refilled somebody's glass. I want to say I felt nothing, but that wouldn't be honest. There was a small, sharp sting, the kind that comes less from the words themselves and more from watching an entire room accept them without question. But underneath that sting was something steadier, something I'd carried quietly in my coat pocket for 3 weeks now. My invitation hadn't come through a fundraising committee or a chief of staff with a good LinkedIn profile. It had come through a channel Brandon didn't know existed, sealed with a QR code that would mean something very specific to the right person standing at the right gate. So I let the moment pass. I've learned over the years that patience isn't the same as weakness, and silence isn't the same as defeat. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is let people believe whatever story is easiest for them, right up until the moment the truth simply arrives on its own. Before the night ended, Brandon caught me by the door as I was leaving suitcase in hand for the morning drive. He didn't smile this time. There was something almost serious in his voice, the closest thing to sincerity I'd get from him all week. "When we get there," he said, "don't embarrass me." I looked at him for a long moment, feeling the weight of every graduation he'd skipped, every promotion he'd shrugged off, every homecoming he'd reduced to a question about my paycheck. Then I said simply, "I won't embarrass anyone." He took that as agreement. I let him. We left for Washington early Sunday morning, Brandon's SUV packed so tightly with garment bags that I had to hold my own suitcase on my lap for the first hour of the drive. He'd insisted on driving separately from our parents so he could, in his words, get in the right headspace, which mostly meant 3 hours of him narrating his own career highlights to an audience of one. "You know I shook Senator Halbrook's hand at the spring gala," he said, eyes flicking to me in the rearview mirror like I might have forgotten since the last time he'd mentioned it. "Guy remembered my name the second time. That's how you know you've made an impression." I made a small sound of acknowledgement and looked out the window at the flat stretch of highway sliding by. This was the rhythm of every trip with Brandon, a monologue requiring only occasional punctuation from whoever happened to be sitting nearby. Somewhere past the Maryland line, he started in on advice. Actual unsolicited advice about how to behave in what he called rooms like this. Don't speak unless spoken to. Don't hover near the important people. Let him do the introducing if anyone asked. I listened to all of it with the strange calm of someone watching a familiar play from the wings, having long since memorized every line. I found myself thinking without meaning to about the years that had led to this drive. My graduation from officer training, the ceremony my parents missed because Brandon had a work event that same weekend that nobody wanted to reschedule. My promotion announced over a phone call that lasted 90 seconds because everyone was busy with Brandon's move to a bigger apartment. The month I came home after a deployment, nobody in my family ever asked details about, except to wonder aloud whether the pay bump was worth it. I didn't dwell on any of it long. There's no use rehearsing old wounds when you already know how the story ends. I let the memories surface, acknowledge themselves, and pass the way you'd let a difficult stretch of turbulence pass without gripping the armrest. The hotel when we arrived came with its own small indignities. Brandon had booked himself a suite on the top floor and left me with a standard room 2 floors below, explaining without much apology that he needed the space to think clearly before something this big. I didn't argue. I've shared far worse accommodations under far worse circumstances, and a smaller room with a decent view has never once threatened my sense of who I am. It was in that room, unpacking my dress uniform onto the bed, that my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. I answered on the second ring out of habit more than curiosity. "Colonel Turner." The voice was crisp, formal, unmistakably military. "This is Major Ellison, aide to Admiral Hayes. I'm calling to confirm your arrival details for tomorrow. The Admiral asked me to let you know he'll be waiting near the East Reception Point personally to welcome you in." I thanked him, confirmed the time, and set the phone down slowly. Personally. Waiting. Those weren't words used for someone catching a lucky photo outside a gate. I sat on the edge of the bed for a moment, feeling something settle into place, quiet and certain, like a door closing somewhere far off. Down the hall I could hear Brandon's voice through the wall, already rehearsing some version of tomorrow's small talk to nobody in particular. I thought about the QR code sitting in the inside pocket of my uniform jacket, about the email that had arrived 3 weeks ago, and the trust it represented earned over years nobody in my family had bothered to ask about. I didn't feel triumphant exactly. What I felt was steadier than that, the simple, settled knowledge of a person who has stopped needing anyone's permission to know her own worth. That evening, my mother knocked on my door to ask if I needed help with anything, the kind of gesture that comes late enough to feel more like guilt than kindness. I told her I was fine. She lingered a moment in the doorway, looking at the uniform laid out across my bed, something unreadable passing over her face before she said goodnight and left. The next morning I dressed carefully. Every button aligned, every ribbon in its correct place, the fabric pressed sharp enough to hold a crease you could set a level against. When I stepped out of my room into the hallway where the rest of my family was gathered, waiting for the car conversation stopped for a moment. My father's eyebrows lifted slightly. My mother's hand rose halfway to her mouth. For one full second, nobody said anything at all. Then, Brandon, adjusting his own tie in the hallway mirror, glanced over and broke the silence the only way he knew how. "Looks nice," he said, "but the uniform's not going to get you past the list, Nicole." He smiled like he was doing me a kindness, sparing me some embarrassment before it happened. I straightened my jacket in the mirror beside him, met my own eyes for a moment, and said nothing. I didn't need to. In a few hours, the truth would introduce itself, and no amount of careful phrasing on Brandon's part was going to change what was already in motion. We rode to the White House in near silence, the whole car humming with attention only I understood the real shape of. The security checkpoint outside the East Wing entrance was a study in choreography. Black SUVs idling at the curb, agents in dark suits. Speaking into their sleeves, a line of guests in evening wear inching forward under a white event tent. Brandon straightened his jacket the moment we stepped out of the car, already performing for an audience that hadn't arrived yet. "Stay close," he told our parents. "But let me go first. I've got the credentials sorted." He said credentials the way other men say Rolex, like the word itself was meant to be admired. I hung back near my mother, watching Brandon approach the checkpoint with the particular swagger of a man who has never once doubted a room would open for him. He held his badge out before the agent even asked, chin lifted, and said loud enough for the people behind us to hear, "Brandon Turner, I should be on the VIP list." The agent scanned it. A pause, then a nod, and a gesture toward the general admission line. Brandon's smile flickered for half a second before he recovered it, waving cheerfully at nobody in particular as he stepped through. He turned back toward me with the same smile stretched a little too wide and said loud enough to carry, "Go on, get behind me. Maybe they'll take pity on you." A few people near us laughed, the easy laughter of strangers who don't know they're watching the wrong scene. I stepped forward without hurrying. I reached into my coat and produced the small card I'd carried since that email arrived 3 weeks earlier, the one with a QR code that meant nothing to Brandon and everything to the person about to scan it. The agent took it, and I watched her posture change in real time. Her shoulders squared. Her expression shifted from routine courtesy to something closer to alertness. She looked at her screen again, then at me, then pressed a small radio clip to her collar and said something too quiet to hear. A second agent moved toward us. I felt Brandon's eyes on me, delighted, clearly assuming I'd triggered some kind of problem. "Trouble already," he said under his breath, not quite able to hide the satisfaction in it. I didn't answer him. I didn't need to. A tall man in dress uniform, silver stars catching the tent lights, was already crossing toward us with the unmistakable bearing of someone used to rooms rearranging themselves around him. The young woman at the checkpoint turned to him and said 4 words that changed the temperature of everything around us. "Sir, she's here." The Admiral extended his hand to me before he'd even fully arrived, and I took it, feeling the old familiar steadiness settle back into my spine. "Colonel Turner," he said, "welcome. We've been expecting you." Behind me, I heard my mother's breath catch. I didn't turn around to look at Brandon's face, though I didn't need to. I could feel the silence radiating off him like heat off pavement. "Admiral Hayes," I said, "thank you for having me." "The honor's ours," he replied, and then glancing briefly past me at my very quiet family, "Please come with me, Colonel. The ceremony can't begin without you." I walked past the general admission line, past the velvet rope, past my brother standing frozen with his badge still in his hand, the one that had gotten him exactly as far as the ordinary line and no further. I didn't gloat. I didn't need to say a single word to him. The moment had already said everything necessary on its own. As I passed, I caught the briefest glimpse of Brandon's face, not anger, yet not even embarrassment, just a kind of stunned recalculation, like a man watching a map he'd trusted his whole life turn out to have been drawn upside down. Walking beside Admiral Hayes toward the East Wing entrance, I felt something unclench in my chest that I hadn't fully realized I'd been holding for years. Not vindication exactly. I've never needed Brandon's humiliation to feel whole, but something quieter and more solid. A recognition finally spoken aloud in a place that mattered of years I'd spent doing work nobody at my family's dinner table had ever thought to ask about. "Long flight in?" the Admiral asked as we walked, making easy conversation the way senior officers often do to put junior ones at ease, though I hadn't needed easing in a long time. "Not too bad, sir," I said. "Just a long drive with family." Something in my tone must have carried more than I intended, because he glanced at me with the faint, knowing look of a man who has led people long enough to read what isn't said. He didn't ask further. He didn't need to. Some things you simply recognize in another person's voice, the way you recognize weather changing before the sky confirms it. Behind us, I heard my mother's voice, thin and uncertain, asking Brandon something I couldn't quite make out. I didn't turn to check. Whatever explanation he was reaching for, it wasn't going to be one that fit the last 20 years neatly enough to satisfy her. We reached the entrance to the East Room, where an usher in white gloves held the door and inclined his head toward me with the kind of respect that requires no explanation and asks for none. I stepped through uniform sharp jacket, settled every ribbon exactly where it belonged. Behind me the door closed. My family and everything they thought they understood about where I belonged stayed on the other side of it. The East Room was arranged in careful rows of gilded chairs beneath 3 enormous chandeliers, the kind of space that makes people lower their voices without being told to. An usher guided me toward the second row from the front, a section reserved for honorees and senior officers, close enough to see the podium's grain, and the flag creases pressed sharp behind it. I found my seat between a colonel I didn't recognize and a woman in a State Department badge, both of whom nodded at me the way people nod at someone they assume belongs exactly where they are. I glanced back once discreetly and found my family several rows behind the rope line, tucked into general seating with the rest of the guests who'd come in through the standard checkpoint. My mother sat rigid, eyes forward. My father kept adjusting his cuffs. Brandon sat with his arms crossed, jaw set in the particular way of a man replaying a scene in his head and not liking any version of how it ends. The ceremony opened the way these things usually do, with a color guard and a chaplain's brief invocation, and then the program moved into recognitions. A master of ceremonies stepped to the podium, and I felt my pulse settle into something slow, and even the same calm I've relied on more times than I can count. "This next recognition," the announcer said, "honors an officer whose actions during a classified humanitarian evacuation last year protected the lives of 31 American civilians under hostile conditions abroad." The details were spare, deliberately so enough to convey weight without wandering into anything I wasn't cleared to have spoken about in a public room. For extraordinary service and composure under fire, we recognize Colonel Nicole Turner. My name moved through the room the way a stone moves through still water, one ripple at a time. I stood, smoothed my jacket, and walked to the podium without hurrying, aware of every eye in the room, most of them belonging to strangers, 3 of them belonging to people who had spent years believing they knew exactly who I was, I didn't look for Brandon's face specifically. I didn't need to. I could feel the silence radiating from that section of the room, regardless thick and complicated, nothing like the polite applause rising around it. My mother, I learned later, cried during those few minutes, though not entirely from pride. She told me afterward it was something closer to shame, the sudden physical weight of remembering every dismissive comment made at every dinner table over every one of my quiet years. Brandon didn't cry. He sat very still, watching people around him rise for a standing ovation, meant for a person he had spent the entire weekend trying to keep out of a room. At the podium, I kept my remarks short. I've never trusted long speeches, mine or anyone else's, and this moment didn't call for one. I spoke briefly about the people I'd served alongside, about quiet work that doesn't come with headlines, about the kind of service that asks nothing of an audience because it was never meant to have one. I said something about dignity not requiring witnesses to be real. I didn't mention Brandon by name. I didn't need to. Some people in that audience would understand exactly what I meant, and the ones who didn't had no reason to. When I stepped down, Admiral Hayes shook my hand again, and a photographer captured the moment for what I later learned would be an official Department of Defense release. Somewhere behind me in general seating, I imagine Brandon watching that photograph get taken and understanding for the first time in his life that not every important picture requires his presence in the frame. The reception afterward moved into an adjoining hall, cordoned by a line of aides and a discreet rope that separated honorees from general guests. I was speaking with the State Department officer from earlier when I caught sight of Brandon approaching, weaving through the crowd with the particular energy of a man trying to look casual while clearly on a mission. He'd clearly spotted an opportunity, proximity to me, and by extension proximity to whatever this recognition represented. He didn't get far. A young aide in a dark suit stepped smoothly into his path before he'd crossed halfway across the room, polite but immovable. "Only authorized personnel beyond this point, sir," she said, the same even tone she likely used 100 times that evening for 100 different guests who'd wandered too close to the wrong section. Brandon opened his mouth, I imagined, to explain that he was my brother, that surely that meant something, but the aide had already turned to greet the next person in line, and the moment closed itself before he could finish forming the sentence. I watched this from across the room without moving toward him, without any particular satisfaction, just a plain settled awareness of how thoroughly the evening had rearranged itself. For years, Brandon had decided where I stood in every room we shared. Tonight, for the first time, the room had made its own decision, and it hadn't required my permission or his approval. I finished my conversation with the officer, accepted a few more handshakes from people whose names I'd likely forget by morning, and allowed myself quietly to simply exist in a moment that belonged entirely to me. Not shared, not borrowed, not something I needed anyone at that rope line to validate. Across the room, my mother caught my eye, once her expression somewhere between pride and apology, unable to settle fully into either. I gave her a small nod, nothing more. There would be time later for whatever conversation was coming. Tonight wasn't for that. Tonight was simply for standing finally in a room I had earned my own way into. I thought the story ended at that rope line, but Brandon has never been a man to let a bad night stay bad without trying to rewrite it. By the following morning before our flight home, he'd already found a way to make the ceremony about himself. I saw it first on my phone during breakfast, a notification from an old family friend tagging me in a comment. Brandon had posted a photo from the reception, a wide shot, clearly cropped from someone else's angle, showing me at the podium in the distant background while he stood in the foreground looking solemn and proud. The caption read, "So honored to have been there when my sister was recognized at the White House. Proud doesn't even begin to cover it. Family support means everything in moments like these." I read it twice, feeling less anger than a kind of tired familiarity. This was, after all, the same instinct that had driven him to raise his badge like a trophy at a checkpoint less than 24 hours earlier. Somewhere in his mind, the story had already rewritten itself into one where he'd played some quiet, supportive role in getting me there. I let it go. People believe what they need to believe, and I've never had the energy to correct every version of a story that isn't mine to manage. I finished my coffee, packed my uniform carefully into its garment bag, and told myself the post would fade the way these things usually do. It didn't fade. It escalated. 3 days after we got home, a former colleague from the Pentagon called me, her voice carrying a note of caution I don't often hear from her. "Nicole," she said, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me. Does your brother have any actual relationship with Defense Department leadership?" I told her no, none whatsoever, and asked why. She explained that Brandon had been circulating emails to several of his consulting clients, describing himself as having direct access to senior defense contacts through his sister, and using that claim to open conversations about a government relations contract his firm was pursuing. He'd attached the cropped photo from the ceremony as supporting material. My name, my rank, and my recent recognition had become, without my consent, a bullet point in his business pitch. I sat with that information for a long moment after we hung up, feeling something colder settle in than the sting I'd felt at the checkpoint. This wasn't vanity anymore. This was Brandon using my name, my service, and quite possibly implying access to information I was never authorized to share, all to close a deal. That kind of claim doesn't just embarrass a family. It raises questions with people who take security seriously. People who don't distinguish easily between a harmless exaggeration and something that looks on paper like a genuine breach. An aide from the ethics office reached out to me the following week, careful and procedural in the way these conversations always are, confirming that Brandon's firm had come up in an inquiry regarding misrepresented government affiliations. Nothing about me was in question. But my name was attached to the situation whether I liked it or not, and that meant I couldn't simply ignore it and hope it resolved itself. I called Brandon that evening. He answered on the first ring, which told me he already knew something was wrong. "Nicole, thank God," he said, his voice missing its usual polish. "Listen, I need your help. People are asking a lot of questions, and I don't know what to tell them." I let a silence sit there for a moment before answering. "What exactly have you been telling your clients about me?" He hesitated, the kind of hesitation that confirms an answer before it's spoken. I mentioned the ceremony. I said we're close. That's all. I didn't think anyone would look into it." "You used my name and my rank to help close a business deal," I said, keeping my voice level. "You told people I have contacts I've never mentioned to you, doing work I've never discussed with you, in a job you don't understand well enough to describe accurately, even if you wanted to. I just wanted people to take me seriously," he said, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, there was nothing performative in his voice at all, just something small and frightened underneath it. "You told me 3 weeks ago I wasn't getting in," I said quietly. "Now you want to use my name to walk through doors of your own." He didn't have an answer for that. I could hear him breathing on the other end of the line, and for once he didn't fill the silence with something clever. I sent a formal notice the next morning through the appropriate channel requesting that Brandon cease using my name, rank, and image for any personal or professional purpose going forward. It wasn't an act of cruelty. It was the plainest kind of boundary, the sort I should have set years earlier, back when the smaller comments were still small enough to overlook. I didn't do it to punish him, though I understood it would feel that way to him. I did it because some things matter more than family comfort, my integrity, the trust placed in me by people who'd spent years watching how I carried myself under conditions Brandon has never had to imagine. He called twice more that week. I let both calls go to voicemail. Whatever apology he was building toward, I wanted it to arrive without an audience this time, without cameras, without anyone left to impress. The real reckoning, I understood by then, hadn't happened at that checkpoint at all. It was happening now quietly in the space where Brandon was finally being asked to account for himself without me standing there to soften the landing. My mother arranged a dinner 2 weeks later, calling it a chance for the family to come back together. I understood it for what it actually was, an attempt to smooth over the version of events that had gotten uncomfortably public, and quite possibly an attempt to convince me to lift the notice I'd sent regarding Brandon's use of my name. I went anyway. Not because I owed anyone an evening, but because I wanted to see clearly and without illusion where things actually stood. The restaurant was quiet, the kind of place my mother chooses when she wants a conversation to feel important. Brandon arrived a few minutes late, which was unusual for him, and sat down without his usual performance of greeting the whole table individually. He looked for the first time in longer than I could remember like a man who'd run out of material. Dinner started carefully. Small talk about the weather, about a cousin's new job, about nothing that mattered. It was my mother who finally broke the surface of it, setting down her fork with a small, deliberate motion. "We just didn't realize," she said, looking at me with an expression somewhere between apology and confusion, "how important you'd become. I don't think any of us understood." I considered that for a moment before answering. "I don't need to be important for you to have respected me," I said, keeping my voice even. I needed that a long time before any ceremony happened. She didn't have a response for that. She looked down at her plate, and for a while nobody spoke. Brandon cleared his throat eventually, the sound of a man forcing himself into a conversation he'd rather avoid. "Look, Nicole, I know things got out of hand," he said. "I was just joking around at the checkpoint, and with the clients I wanted people to think I had connections. I didn't think it would actually cause a problem for you." I let that sit in the air for a moment before responding. I wasn't interested in raising my voice, and I wasn't interested in performing forgiveness I hadn't actually arrived at yet. Instead, I simply laid it out plainly, the way I might brief a difficult situation to someone who needed the full picture rather than a partial one. "You weren't at my graduation," I said. "You had an event that weekend and nobody thought to reschedule around it. When I made Colonel, I found out over a 90-second phone call because you were busy moving apartments. When I came home from deployment, the only question anyone asked me was about my paycheck. And 3 weeks ago, you told me in front of half our family that I probably wasn't getting in." Nobody at the table said anything. Brandon's jaw tightened, and for once he didn't have a clever line waiting to smooth things over. There was nowhere left for him to redirect the conversation, no new detail to distract from the pattern I'd just laid out plainly enough that even he couldn't argue around it. I wasn't angry anymore, not in the way I might have been years earlier. What I felt instead was something calmer and more final, the simple clarity of a person who has stopped needing an apology to know her own worth. "I'm not cutting anyone out of my life," I said, looking at my mother, then at Brandon. "But I'm done letting people use my name, my rank, or my work to serve themselves. If you want to be part of my life going forward, it starts with actual respect, not performance, not photo captions, the real thing." My mother reached for my hand across the table, her eyes wet, and this time I let her hold it for a moment before gently pulling it back. Some gestures need time before they mean what they're trying to mean. Brandon didn't say much else for the rest of the dinner. I think for the first time he understood there was no clever angle left to work, no version of the story he could still control. That more than anything is what finally reached him. Not the ceremony, not the checkpoint, not even the ethics inquiry. It was simply running out of an audience willing to let him rewrite the truth. I left the restaurant before dessert arrived, telling my mother I had an early morning. Outside, the DC air had that particular chill it gets in early evening streetlights just beginning to flicker on along the avenue. I walked toward the hotel, slowly past the glass front of the lobby, catching my own reflection in it for a moment, before stepping through the doors. I didn't feel triumphant. I want to be honest about that. This wasn't a story about making Brandon feel small, though I understand how it might look that way from the outside. What I felt instead, standing there in the quiet hum of a city that had for one evening finally seen me clearly, was something steadier. Something that didn't need anyone's permission to exist. That night, I realized I hadn't been waiting for them to let me in. I had already earned my place. If this story meant something to you, I'd love to know where it found you. Tell me in the comments what part hit you the hardest. Was it the checkpoint, the dinner table, or something quieter in between? I have so many more stories like Nicole's waiting to be told stories about the quiet ones who finally get their moment. So, if you don't want to miss what's coming next, hit subscribe and stay close. Let's keep walking through these doors together.